Hello, everyone. Welcome to City Arts and Lectures virtual edition. This was a talk that was supposed to be live in person in San Francisco. The coronavirus has made that impossible, but we're happy to be doing it anyway. My name is Astra Taylor. I'm a writer, a documentary filmmaker, and the co-founder of the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors. And I am speaking today with Robert Reich, who really needs no introduction. He's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. You may know him from such films as Saving Capitalism, which you can see on Netflix. We all have time to actually watch that now. And he's the author of 17 books, including most recently The System, Who Rigged It, and How We Fix It. And he has worked in several administrations, including the Clinton administration. So thank you so much for being here, Robert. It's quite a day for us to talk. A couple of months ago when this event was planned, I was thinking, okay, we'll really dig into the legacy of the 2008 financial crisis and the fact that our society is so unequal. And we're living, I think you and I both agree, under a situation of oligarchy where a tiny number of people control an inordinate amount of wealth and power in the society. We're in a situation we couldn't have imagined even a week ago right now. And I'm sure that that's what people really want to hear about. And a bailout is unfolding before our eyes. Can you give us a sense of where we are at this moment?
Yes, and I will just in a moment. But Astra, I want to tell you how thrilled I am that you are doing this interview and you agreed to do it. I'm very sorry we're not doing it in person. Hopefully we will at some time in the future. But I'm a great fan. Your books are fabulous, and you are kind of multifaceted. I'm a great believer that it's important to get the truth out in a variety of ways, in documentaries and videos and books, and I think you are exactly on my same page, as it were, metaphysically and metaphorically speaking. Okay, so where are we right now? We are in a national crisis, a pandemic. Everybody knows that. Everybody feels it. People should be locked down and sheltering in place, although there's a vast confusion about what sheltering in place actually means and how seriously to take all this. Even today, our president has expressed some ambivalence about how serious all of this is, saying that maybe it's not as serious as it was being taken or is being taken. Maybe in 2 weeks people ought to be able to go back to what they were doing before. He seems utterly clueless as to what's happening. Much of Wall Street and corporate America view this, not surprisingly, through the lens that they view everything, and that is economics. And it's a particular kind of economics. It's big business and financial economics. They see this crisis as a crisis of the stock market, which has lost about 25 to 30% of its value in a very short amount of time. They see this as needing some sort of spectacular government rescue for big corporations, big stimulus package. The Fed should go into, and it already is going into, a kind of what's called quantitative easing, buying back bonds, as if the central issue is the economy. Well, the central issue is not the economy. The economic collapse is not really an economic collapse. It's an economic pause. We are shutting down the economy for a very good and important reason, and that is because we have a pandemic. And unless the economy is shut down, people will not stay home. Unless they stay home, they will not be safe. Unless they are safe, they will not be able to have their lives. Some people will lose their lives. And so this is a matter of life or death. It's not a matter of the gross domestic product or the level of the Dow Jones Industrial Average or corporate profits and losses. This is a matter of people and individuals and lives and families. This is, it's no longer and shouldn't be trickle-down economics. We are really now talking about not economics at all. We're talking about public health. We're talking about safety. We're talking about people. And the most important thing we can do is make sure that people have income so that they can maintain themselves and their families, have a roof over their heads, pay the rent, get food, and that hospitals have enough equipment, and that people can, if they absolutely must, get medical assistance and can afford it. Now, you see, this is the opposite end of the telescope I'm talking about right now. And unfortunately, the people who are really going to be most vulnerable, and I'm talking about poor people, working class people, homeless people, undocumented workers, they have no voice at all. I mean, they might as well be on a different planet for the impact that they are having in the halls of our federal government right now. And indeed, this is what I was trying to get at in my book, The System, because the subtitle is Who Rigged It and How We Fix It. And that book is all about power, who has it and who doesn't have it, and why it's important for us to talk about power. And you in your books have done much the same thing. Power is something that we don't talk about nearly enough.
Yeah. I want to talk about how we try to generate power in this moment, because we still have some. We have to figure out how to have civil disobedience in an age of social distancing and solidarity in an age of social distancing. So those are things I want to get to. I keep thinking about the phrase "save the economy," and what you made me think is, well, what we need to be doing is saving people, right? But how?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How is it that this frame of the economy is this separate thing that has to come first? How has that led us so astray? And what does it mean when you say the economy is actually, what we need to do is just pause things? I mean, I think people might say, how is that possible, right? And what, so, and we're thinking about this as an economic crisis, but it doesn't have to be, right?
No, it's a health crisis.
Yes.
It's not an economic crisis. The economic problems are a consequence of the health crisis and a consequence of doing what we should do in a health crisis, which is shut down the economy. Now, some people, and again, this is the dominant Wall Street corporate view, are analogizing this to the Great Depression or the Great Recession starting in 2008. This has nothing to do with the Great Depression. It has nothing to do with the Great Recession. Those two economic problems, calamities, depending upon where you stood, those two were the result of big explosions of asset bubbles bursting and what economists call liquidity crises, in which a lot of big businesses and banks simply could not meet their payments, and that did trickle down through the rest of the economy in a very negative way. This has nothing to do with that. This is a pandemic. We haven't seen anything like this since the pandemic of 1918. And we don't have good economic data for knowing what happened in the pandemic of 1918. But the pandemic of 1918 did not require a gigantic, and it would have been inappropriate to have had a gigantic bailout of companies or a gigantic $2 trillion stimulus package or the Treasury Department being in charge of anything. No, the pandemic of 1918 required public health measures, rapid, as fast as possible. We still lost hundreds of thousands of Americans, but that pandemic was not an economic per se problem. We ought to be viewing today's issues in exactly this with the same lenses. It's not an economic problem. It's a human problem. Mm-hmm. Instead of bailing out companies, we ought to bail out people. Make sure people are whole and can get themselves and their families through this.
I mean, because right now, in a sense, everybody's job, if you can, is to stay home. It's either to provide a vital service like healthcare or food or, making sure the infrastructure of our communities works. And then for those of us who can, we need to shelter in place. And so this is where the idea of bailing out the people comes in, right? Get money to people so they can stay home, meet their needs, and weather this storm. That seems very sensible, but that's not what our leaders are going to push for at this moment. Can you tell us a bit about where the discussions in Washington are and why so many people with with political power don't see this in the terms that you're laying out for us, right? They're framing this very much as economic.
I can tell you from my years, I've spent maybe just about a third of my adult life in Washington. And I wish I could tell you they were happy years. They were very stressful years. I don't want to suggest to you that anybody in Washington is there for the fun of it. Some people are there for the ego of it and for the narcissism of it, but many people are there for the right reasons. But they are easily misguided because the most powerful forces working on Washington, and I've seen this increase over the last 40 years, are big corporations and Wall Street. And the voice of average people that used to be expressed through, for example, trade unions or cooperatives or even political parties that were rooted in locales and in states, those kinds of voices have become muted as big money has taken over our politics. And so what we see as a result is that this crisis has morphed into not only this kind of faux economic crisis that we were talking about a moment ago, but also bailouts for companies. Now, no big company needs to be bailed out. The idea of bailing out the airlines is absurd. The airlines in the 1990s and in the 2010s, the airlines went into bankruptcy. I mean, all major airlines, just about virtually all major airlines, went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcy sounds pretty awful, but bankruptcy actually was a business technique used by the airlines to get out from under onerous,
Unions.
what they thought to be onerous union contracts. They all did it. They merged like mad. And so, in 1980, we had 12 airlines. Now, in the United States, we have 4 major carriers. They are an oligopoly, which is a fancy term for, when you have 3 or 4 major players in an industry, they roughly coordinate their prices and their wages and everything else. They use their monopoly power. And that's why we've seen for years airlines reducing services, reducing legroom, now you have to pay for everything. You have to pay for your bag checks and all kinds of things. Well, this is not an industry that deserves to be bailed out. Over the last 10 years, they've used 96% of their free cash flow to buy back their own shares of stock, which benefited nobody except the top executives and the major investors. Nothing trickled down. That tax cut in December of 2017 that Trump and the Republicans who sponsored that, they promised that it would mean, huge investments by big companies. Their workers would get big raises. And, well, we've been through this before. Nothing happened. The aircraft industry, the airline industry, the cruise industry, the hotel industry, all the industries that are now demanding and getting, at least via the Republican plan, bailouts, they just took the money and used it to buy back their shares of stock. That's exactly what they'll do now. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, last week was rounding up Wall Street executives to help Mnuchin with overseeing the bailout. Now, talking about foxes and hen houses, this is foxes guarding the foxes, guarding the foxes. The hens are nowhere to be seen. And this is all, Astra, about power. Those who have it see the world in one way. They see this as an economic crisis, and they also see the remedy as big bailouts and basically helping, although they wouldn't put it this way, obviously, and maybe they don't even think of it exactly this way, but it's helping their friends. It's helping other very wealthy and very influential and powerful people.
They
Meanwhile,
see it as
yeah, sorry.
No, I'm saying they see it as a crisis and an opportunity. Why not take this crisis and push for, policies that are other policies that you would default to, which is more of the same, more deregulation, weakening the status of workers, et cetera.
Yes, more tax breaks, more deregulation, more subsidies, more bailouts. Interestingly, the big companies, the industries, and that are seeking these bailouts, and Republicans are very careful not to use the word bailout. They're using loans. But if it were just loans, these big companies could just go to capital markets right now. Capital is very cheap. I mean, if you want a loan, you can get it.
Right.
No, the reason that the federal government is getting involved is that these are subsidized. These are subsidized loans. This is what they can't get in the market. This is where the free market is not working, at least according to these big companies. They want big handouts. It's sort of analogous to Senator Richard Burr getting information, inside information, cashing in on that inside information about a coming pandemic and its effects on certain big industries, making out like a bandit, cashing in about $1.5 million, and that before anybody else lost their retirement savings. Well, it's that kind of it's beyond selfishness. I think it's morally repugnant for people with wealth and power and privilege to be exploiting their positions of wealth and power and privilege at this point in time, at this national emergency, when people desperately need help. They need income support. They need medical assistance. Hospitals need to have the kind of equipment and cash and reserves that they don't have. And what in the world are we doing? Instead, we're talking about giving bailouts to big corporations.
I feel like one thing that the financial sector always does is it mystifies itself, right? Like, oh, we're so complicated. It's too complicated for the average person to understand. And that's, partly what this moment does. Suddenly we're talking about quantitative easing and loans and securities, and it all seems over the heads of regular people. But what we need right now is actually pretty simple, right? In terms of, and so I just would love for you to hear that from you, and because people are so overwhelmed. I mean, I think how many people I know who have lost their jobs or who are already sick with coronavirus or who are working in the healthcare sector. People are afraid, they're frantic. It's hard to keep up with the news. So if you could just say really, simply, what is it people should be demanding right now of the federal government, in the clearest, most basic terms, a couple of things that a smart economic policy would entail at this moment?
Well, they're both basically only three things. And again, it's not economic policy. This is humane policy. This is public health and safety. Number one, income support. That is, people need to be home. They need to get money so that they can pay their bills, pay their rent, pay their mortgages, so that they are not kicked out of their homes. They need to be able to buy food. We're talking about pretty essential, basic things. This is not complicated. Now, how do you get income support to people? Well, we have something already there called the unemployment insurance system. It needs to be dramatically expanded. Unemployment insurance now goes to a small fraction of the people who don't have jobs, but it can be expanded. It can be made universal. Now, in a former life, I used to run, or at least oversee, the unemployment insurance system. So I know what is there. I know that it is possible to make this quickly into a universal system, as long as the federal government provides states with adequate funding. The second thing people need is they need to be able to go to a doctor if they think they have or could have the virus, to get tests, and maybe, hopefully not, but maybe to be admitted and get whatever treatment they need. Well, that takes money. We ought to have universal, temporary maybe, I mean, I'd love to have it forever, but universal Medicare for all, or universal Medicaid for all, however you want to put it. But we already have these systems in place. We just need to expand them quite dramatically, so nobody has to worry about it. So if they go into a hospital, it's taken care of. And the third thing is the hospitals themselves need to have equipment, ventilators, ICUs, intensive care units. They need masks. you and I were talking before. I've got a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law who are both nurses. They are right now, as we speak, in hospitals that don't have adequate protective gear for them. This is unconscionable. It's like sending our troops off to war without adequate protective gear. Why are we doing this? Donald Trump says, well, even though I have the power, he says, under the Defense Production Act, to force companies to produce all of this stuff that is needed by hospitals, I'm not going to do it because I believe in the free market. Well, that's the same Donald Trump who's been negotiating bailouts for these big companies. If you believe in the free market, you ought to do it just the opposite. You ought to actually not have any bailouts for companies, but you also, at the same time, you should be using the authority you have under the Defense Production Act to make sure that what is absolutely critically needed and in short supply for our hospitals gets to our hospitals. So that's what ought to be done. This is not, again, it's not rocket science. It's not complicated. It has nothing to do with Wall Street. It has nothing to do with derivatives or liquidity or anything that the Fed might be doing in terms of buying back bonds, quantitative easing. People hear the term quantitative easing. Oh, well, the Fed is engaged in quantitative easing. Isn't that wonderful? The Fed is doing, well, that's irrelevant to what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get to the issue of power in a minute, but I think one thing this crisis is revealing is how brittle our systems were and how inadequate they were, right? And
exactly.
This word. Sorry, I've been thinking that
it's hard to. And I apologize for jumping over your sentences and you're jumping over mine because.
Oh no, it's because I just froze, so I'm sorry. So yeah, keep going. But I think that could you talk about this sort of what has been laid bare? For example, the healthcare system, I think, is a great example of the fact that because of a kind of market failure, hospitals they're run very close to the bone. They don't have a lot of they don't have the resources to have staff for these emergencies, right?
Right. Well, that's right. Now, our hospital system is essentially a private, for-profit, corporate healthcare system. Most hospitals are parts of private, for-profit, corporate, large conglomerates. That's not every hospital, but that's almost a majority of hospitals right now. And that kind of system does not run on excess capacity. That kind of system runs on what is absolutely necessary. You cut out all excess capacity because if you have shareholders, those shareholders don't want to pay for excess capacity. It's interesting, Astra, as we talk about this, when you think about the financial system, which is really about the only system we have that is treated as a system. Mm-hmm. You have the Fed that oversees the financial system and makes sure that the banks have excess capacity in terms of the banks have to have enough dollars on hand. But we don't have the equivalent of a Fed for our hospitals that are demanding that the hospitals have excess capacity for an emergency. We don't have a public health system. Other countries, advanced, wealthy countries, Europe, Canada, they have public health systems. They have well-staffed state and provincial systems that really do prepare for public health crises that have, for example, as we've seen in other countries like South Korea, adequate testing gear can be generated very, very quickly. We don't have a public health system in this country. We have a private for-profit healthcare system, and that's about it. And we've got a social safety net system, social services system that is sketchy and spotty and full of holes. It's not really anything comparable to what other countries have. Unemployment insurance we've already talked about, but let me ask you, Astra, the percentage of people in this country who lose their job, who are eligible for unemployment insurance, is actually less than 30% at any given point in time. Mm-hmm. And that's largely, and again, I can say this because I used to oversee this hodgepodge of state unemployment insurance systems. That's largely because the states require for eligibility that people be in a full-time job for 2 years before they lose their job.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably know these data better than I do, but in terms of jobs, it's fewer and fewer the number of people who are in a full-time job for 2 years. Most people, particularly in the bottom half of our income distribution, are in jobs for less than a year, maybe 18 months. Many of them are not in jobs at all. They're working as freelancers or they're working as contract workers, and they don't have any job security whatsoever. So none of these people are eligible for unemployment insurance.
And it's surreal, right? I mean, I saw a statistic floating around a few months ago, which seems like another world, that said something like 90% of academic hires were adjunct, right? So therefore, even in institutions that used to provide a sort of secure employment are moving over to the insecure piecework. And so, even these places you would associate with good jobs relatively recently don't provide them anymore.
Yes, in fact, exactly right. It's the dominant model in the private sector, the private corporate for-profit sector, has leached into the public sector, even universities. And you're 100% right. Much of the hiring now, much of the teaching is being done by adjuncts and by lecturers and by teaching assistants, graduate school students. None of them makes much money. In fact, they're close to the minimum wage, if even at the minimum wage.
So two things I want to say in response to that. I mean, one thing I just read today is that hospitals, because of exactly the system you've laid out, are actually experiencing a kind of financial crisis of their own because they've put off all elective surgeries and non-emergencies to make space for coronavirus patients and the need for quarantine and safety. So now they're not getting the income that they need to run. So that is a sector that may well need some sort of bailout. But because it's not adequately publicly funded, they actually might not be able to financially sustain an emergency like this one. That
exactly.
Which is it's absurd.
Well, it is absurd. But again, here too, we've got to be very careful that we not bail out the hospital corporations.
Yes.
And forget about the nurses and the nurse practitioners and the doctors and the patients. I mean, they are we have to make sure the people on the front line are well protected and well treated. The hospital corporations and their shareholders, well, I don't want to say let's not worry about them, but let's not worry about them. That's not what they are not the problem right now. They are not the people that need to be saved and considered in this crisis.
So in terms of power, the system that you've described, this totally inadequate system of unemployment insurance, the fact that people in the United States can't access adequate health care because they can't afford it. We know that over 60% of bankruptcies are linked to medical debt in this country, right? I mean, I part of this is about power because it's about keeping regular working people insecure. I mean, the reason that employers prefer a system of for-profit healthcare instead of universal healthcare is that then, when you do get employment, when you do get healthcare benefits, it's through your job, and therefore that gives your employer more power over your life. You're more inclined to stay even if the working conditions aren't great. I mean, so these inadequate safety nets are about disempowering working people, to my mind.
And it's become much worse over the last 40 years, Astra. I'm old enough to remember in the 1950s and 60s when actually the country was becoming more equal. That is, people in the bottom fifth, the bottom 20%, regardless of race or ethnicity, they were actually doing better at a faster pace than people at the top. It's hard to believe, but that's actually what was happening. They still didn't have civil rights through the 50s and 60s. We needed the Civil Rights Act. We needed the Voting Rights Act. We needed to open the doors and gates to women. And people with disabilities. And these challenges are still obviously in front of us. But what began to happen in the late 70s and with accelerated intensity in the 1980s, is that wealth and power began moving upward, and wages stagnated. Adjusted for inflation, the typical worker today is earning less than he or she did in the late 1970s. And the economy, the United States economy, is almost 3 times as large. Well,
Yeah.
it's not, there's no surprise as to what happened. A lot of that wealth and the power that goes with wealth and the wealth that goes with power went up to the top. And so that the safety nets, the healthcare system, all began to fray. Our educational system began to come apart. Our system of public higher education, which used to be supported by taxpayers, also began to come apart. Because you see, people at the top began to change the system. They began to withdraw their tax support from the system. Marginal income taxes on the top went down. In the 1950s and 60s, the typical very wealthy American was paying a rate of taxes that, even after all the deductions and tax credits were considered, was well over 50%. A marginal income tax, top incomes. Well, now, of course, it's almost nothing when you consider all of the tax credits and tax deductions and all of the ways in which the very wealthy are using loopholes that have been put into the tax code over the last 20, 30 years, certainly since Ronald Reagan. Yeah. And the wealthy are managing to basically shield their wealth from taxation. This is why it was so important that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren came up with a wealth tax, put that squarely on the public's mind, in the public's mind. Yeah. Because in the 1950s, 1960s, most people who were very wealthy, they supported the federal government by paying taxes. They no longer do that. They now support the federal government by buying bonds. Yeah. By basically lending the federal government money.
Getting interest.
And then they collect a lot of interest. Not right now, but under normal circumstances. So I guess the overall picture is that over the last 40 years, as wealth and power has gone to the top, the healthcare system, the safety net system, the social service system that we all so desperately need right now was beginning to come apart. Again, one more historical point. When Blue Cross and Blue Shield began as the kind of health insurance system, that's what we began with in the 1950s and early 1960s, they were not-for-profit. Mm-hmm. They were specifically and intentionally not-for-profit because health insurance was considered to be something that should not be for-profit. Mm-hmm. In 1965, when Medicare and Medicaid were instituted, those were also considered to be on their way. It was slow coming, but on their way to getting everybody insured. If the not-profit Blue Cross Blue Shield system couldn't do it, well, Medicare and Medicaid could do it. And all of that began also coming apart in the 1980s. As wealth and power went to the top, even our Blue Cross Blue Shield private health insurance system went from being a nonprofit system to being a highly for-profit system. And as we said, all of our hospitals and our entire healthcare infrastructure became corporate.
Yep. Well, and now, nothing like this crisis to show that actually this idea of having your health insurance coverage tied to your employer is really risky, because when there's mass layoffs, that means masses of people losing what minimal access they had to healthcare. So another sign of the weakness. You said something I want to get to. So this issue of power, right now, part of why these companies are able, or these industries are able to have a chance of getting a big payoff is because they're organized, right? They're organized. They're ready to lobby. They can make campaign donations. All of the ways that the system is corrupt that you lay out in your new book, and you do an excellent job of getting us right to the point where we're at today, why it is things are unfolding the way they are.
I
So
didn't
there,
intend. I did ask Esther. I didn't intend to get to this point. I really didn't. I mean,
uh,
it's a huge tragedy. Let's hope that
yeah,
out of this comes a deeper understanding of what's actually
yes.
happening.
Well, I think one word I've been taking solace in, two words. So one is crisis, which from the ancient Greek means a point in a disease where you either heal or you get sick and die. And so we're in a crisis moment, and what? And then the word apocalypse, which actually in its root means the unveiling. It doesn't mean the end of the world. It means to uncover. And so I think we're uncovering some truth in this moment. And so for those of us who are activists who keep fighting, I think we have to try our best to make something of this moment. And so, so the corporations are organized. And as you pointed out in the beginning of our conversation, people aren't. The associations regular people had, trade unions, et cetera, have been really weakened. So this is how I've been thinking about stuff with my activist friends over the last decade. So you said just now, the rich have withdrawn their tax support. And so how we see it is that the rich are on a tax strike. They've been on a tax strike since the late 70s in California when there was the Prop 13 tax revolt. Reagan helped spread that across the country, made it a national issue. And, what we've been doing, we've said the rich have tax strikes, so the poor should go on debt strike, right? The working people don't have wealth. They can withhold their labor. That's what unions do in labor strikes and labor actions. And that debtors can withhold their debt payments. And so we launched the student debt strike in 2015 that has led to over $1 billion of student debt relief and helped get this conversation around student debt cancellation on the table. And right now, even in the midst of this national emergency, some of the solutions being proposed by Democrats at the federal and state level involve pausing debt payments, canceling student debt, as ways to help working people. So I'm just thinking about what forms of countervailing power do you see right now? We're digging into the debtor organizing and trying to see if we can seize this moment, because so many people are going to not be able to pay. And they shouldn't feel ashamed about it. They shouldn't feel bad about that fact, right? This is something beyond their control. But we have to find new forms of power for working people and do our best to intervene. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let's talk about whether it's a debt strike or it's any other kind of a demonstration or a strike or the Occupy movement. Or even contrast what the Occupy movement accomplished vis-a-vis changes politically, which wasn't very much, with what the Tea Party movement, which also grew out of the 2008 financial crisis, what they accomplished politically, which was far more. What I want to put this in the context of politics, because ultimately politics is the expression of power. Laws and regulations at any given time are kind of the crystallization of how power is allocated in society. But how do you get power? How do you actually get back power if you've lost power? I would say that the vast American middle class that was growing by leaps and bounds in the 3 decades after the Second World War, including more and more working people, including eventually more and more black and brown people, began losing power in the 1980s to this is another, you love to use Greek words, and I do too, and oligarchy is a great old Greek word, and I think that we do have an oligarchy in this country. Oligarchy meaning a relatively small number of people who have the wealth and the power and behind the scenes are controlling it. I don't mean in any conspiratorial way. I don't mean we need to think that they've met secretly and they are plotting against the rest of us, but the effect of what they've done, using their wealth and their power to get political changes, legal and regulatory changes that enhance their wealth and their power, and that make it harder for everybody else to join together. That is an abuse of power, obviously, and it's also what the oligarchy what oligarchies do historically. They disempower everybody else. So underlying all of this is the question of how to get back power. That really does finally express itself in laws and regulations and rules that help people. Now, it's too late right now, in the sense that we can't organize the entire United States to get money next week, because there's just not time. People are, 2 million people lost their jobs last week, Astra. There was a 30% increase in unemployment demands or requests or filings for unemployment insurance. This coming week is going to be much worse. In fact, I think that we could easily see unemployment get up to, over the next month or two, 20 to 30% of the workforce. That's as high as it was in the Great Depression. But how do you extract political power out of this? It's happening too fast. And people are sheltering at home. If there was ever something that made political power difficult to us to aggregate, it's when people are separate from each other. So I think what we need to ponder is the lessons of all of this. Let's assume that by August or September or October or November, either before the election or after the election, and we can come back to that, that's a big question, we're out of this. A lot of people have died prematurely in terms of their natural lifespans or what their lifespans could have been. Many people were terribly sickened. Many families were enduring huge burdens. Some people did lose their rental units or their homes. Some people did have terribly difficult times getting the food and nourishment they needed for their families. Well, that memory is going to be seared in people's minds. And I think that is a time in which many of us, you and I and many others, who have witnessed over the last 40 years or 30 or 20 years the migration of power and wealth to the top, we can say, look what has happened. It is vitally important now that we organize. What does organization mean? Is that a third political party? Well, it could be. If, in fact, Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee and he loses to Donald Trump and Trump gets a second term, that's, to me, that's the whistle. Let's form a third party, and let's form a third party that is a workers' party, that is a working people's party. I mean, on a big scale, that puts people first and corporations last. That may be a way of doing it. But here's where I get hung up. Maybe you're thinking, I would love to get your thoughts about all of this. Because protests, like a debtor strike, those are important for attracting attention. And sometimes protests can get politicians to pay enough attention that they actually do something. But the Tea Party movement was less of a protest movement in retrospect than it was a very carefully orchestrated political movement by part of the oligarchy. That is, the oligarchy took over the Tea Party movement. And what the oligarchy that took over the Tea Party movement tried to do was to divide Americans by race, by class, by region, by national origin, by gender, by sexual orientation and preference. In other words, dividing Americans was a technique by the oligarchy to make sure that Americans didn't come together, didn't actually organize, didn't mobilize, didn't understand what was happening to them, that we would all be at each other's throats, kind of fighting over a smaller and smaller share of the pie, while the oligarchy kind of could hide behind Donald Trump, get big tax cuts, one of the biggest tax cuts on record, regulatory rollbacks, all of the kinds of things that it needed and wants without any opposition at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, divide and conquer is an ancient strategy, right? I mean, this is an old trick in the United States of America. I mean, we saw it after the Civil War when there was an attempt to create a sort of multiracial populist movement, and it's happening again. I mean, I think there's interesting. I was part of the Occupy movement, and I was critical of it in the sense that it wouldn't make demands. And, I thought we need to take political power. That needs to be part of this. We need to not have this separation between a protest movement and a political movement. We need to somehow do both at once, because we also know that you can love your elected official, but they also need to either be pushed once they're there, or they need to feel there's wind at their back, right? So we always need that inside and outside strategy. And I think the younger generation is doing a better job of having a kind of radical critique of the economy. We see things like Democratic Socialists of America booming, and they're doing a ton of organizing at the municipal level, the state level, and engaging in electoral politics, while also, having a very deep critique of the status quo. So I think people are learning, but not fast enough. I think right now, so I'm torn about how we proceed, because I think the left has made a really big bid to try to do the electoral strategy. That's what the Sanders campaign was all about, right? And as you just said, we might have a point where there's another Trump victory, and then I think we're going to have to reassess that engagement with the Democratic Party. So my feeling is that whatever path forward is going to have to involve trying to seize every lever of power that's available to working people. And so nothing's off the table. We need to run people for office, support radical candidates. Third parties are easier to do at the municipal level because there are so many rules about ballot access. So it's hard to get a third party, as you know, off the ground for to win a presidential campaign. This is one way the Democrats and the Republicans do really get along. They're very sort of bipartisan in keeping out a third party challenger. That's why we need labor unions, even though they're under attack. But that's why I think we need debtors unions. We can't afford to leave power on the table. I do think right now it's not big enough, but we are seeing, there are some of us who are sheltering at home, and there are lots of people who are still being forced to work. And so what we're seeing is a lot of wildcat actions and petitions and campaigns by people who work in retail, who work at grocery stores. We are seeing protests by Amazon workers. They're protesting their labor conditions in New York. I mean, they're being forced to go physically into work. So they're also physically protesting because they're seeing that they're not being given adequate safety, sanitation, resources and stuff like that. So I think we're actually going to be entering into a moment of unrest, because for a lot of people the conditions are just going to be unbearable. So we're going to have I think this is going to be quite a politically dynamic moment, just because people, like you said, millions of people are suddenly unemployed. They're going to have to make some sort of demands in that situation, because people are not able to live. Yeah, I
think that's right, Astra. One of the saddest aspects of my working life in politics and around politics over the last 30, 40 years has been the Democrats losing the working class.
Yeah.
And it's not just the white working class. The Democrats lost the working class. The Republicans, through a lot of guile and deception, and efforts to use kind of cultural divisions and issues, have tried to get the working class for themselves and have done a fairly good job of that. But without a coalition of the poor and people of color and young people and the working class, it's very difficult to talk about political change. Now, I do think that we're going to see, and we have seen, a lot of wildcat strikes and a lot of tumult. But the most glaring and obvious thing that comes out of this period of terrible national emergency is that power and privilege can and have been exploiting the crisis. Big corporations seeking bailouts, one example. Senators like Richard Burr using inside information, another obvious example. But you see all kinds of companies right now that, like Amazon, using the fact that people desperately need jobs to take advantage of their workers. Workers have less power right now than they had 3 weeks ago because so many people have lost their jobs, are unemployed, are at home. They should be home, but that means that you have basically put employers in a position of even more potential exploitation than they had before. Now, maybe, my hope is that what this does over the next few months is expose the actual contours of power and privilege in a way that just talking about it or writing about it or making videos about it or doesn't really expose. People viscerally feel what's going on. When I talk about don't bail out corporations, bail out people, I'm astounded at the number of responses I get from people who, although I made the same point for years, ever since the Wall Street bailout, now are furious and infuriated that big companies are demanding $500 billion in bailouts. And yet no money or very little money is getting out to any individual. You see, it takes something like this for people to see it. The Wall Street bailout did create the Occupy and the Tea Party movements, both of them, because people living through it, living through that fear, that deprivation, that loss of jobs, loss of homes, loss of savings, they understood that power and privilege were gaining ground. In that case, it was Wall Street, and they held politicians accountable to some extent, not nearly to the extent that they should have been. Well, maybe now, 12 years later, there will be even more of that kind of exposure leading to the kind of tumult and political action you are talking about. I hope so.
Yeah, I think one thing I've been saying is that we've been saying, so for example, the Debt Collective, which I organize with, we've been saying cancel student debt. This is a realistic demand. We laid out the legal arguments that showed the executive branch could do it using power Congress had already vested in the education secretary. And we were laughed at in 2011 and laughed at a bit less as time went on, and then we got some traction. But what we're seeing now is someone like Governor Cuomo saying pause collection, right? We're seeing that it's possible that these rules that we've been living under, can be bent in an instant when there's an emergency. And so I hope that's something that people can hold on to as well. There are a whole lot of rules that have been in place that were only there to reinforce the oligarchy, right? And only there to make society more unequal. And those rules can be changed very fast. And so that should make us question why they're rules to begin with. So,
exactly. There are always rules out there.
Yes.
You can't have an economy or a
Yes.
society without rules. But the rules have been shaped by the oligarchy. Bankruptcy is a good example.
And Joe Biden.
Students used to be able to, until the 1995 Bankruptcy Act. The 2005 Bankruptcy Act. Students could reorganize their debt under bankruptcy. But the creditors and big banks fought that, and they made sure that students could no longer use bankruptcy to reorganize student debt. The same thing happened to homeowners. You can get out from under your debts for your second home. How many people have second homes?
Exactly.
But you can't with regard to your first homes. That is new under bankruptcy law. And the creditors and Wall Street got that put into the bankruptcy code. here again, it's all a matter of who has the power to set the rules of the game. And people have got to understand there's no free market. And the idea of even the framework that has been put out there and sold to people that there's a free market and then there's government. Free market, which do you like? Do you like free market, liberty, or do you like government? Government, heavy-handed government. When in fact you can't have a free market without government. Government sets the rules of the government of the free market, like bankruptcy. And if you see the world as the choice between free market and government, you are missing the major event. You're not asking the right question. The real question is, who is setting the rules of the market? And why is it that people with huge amounts of money and power and big corporations are able to set the rules over and over and over again? We, the people, need to be setting the rules.
Well, one thing you do in the book really well is lay out the sort of tools of the oligarchy and sort of how they maintain their power. One of them is what I would call ideology, right? Sort of the idea that the free market is indeed free and that it's the natural thing. And, right now we're entering a moment where we've been having it all election season, right? This question, well, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for universal health care? How are we going to pay for paid time off? And I think right now we're saying, well, how are we not going to pay for it? Because if we don't have these things, society is collapsing. I guess I was wondering if you could speak on that. And then also the question of deficit spending, because the right wing has gone so hard on this idea of deficit spending, but really the question is just like the question of who are the rules for. It's, well, who are the deficits for, right?
Exactly.
And so I'd love to just hear you maybe bust that myth and give the audience some talking points, because inevitably we all encounter that idea of like, oh, that sounds lovely, but how are we going to pay for it?
Right. Well, this is also an area of demagoguery, this deficit or the national debt. And the right, every time a Democrat is in office, and I can tell you, when I sat there with Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton's team in 1992, the first thing we were walloped with was, well, the debt is too high. You guys are going to increase the deficit, which is going to make the debt even higher. You can't possibly invest in education and healthcare and research and development and give more people better safety nets. Well, you see, there are three kinds of debt. And they're very different. One kind of debt pays past obligations, like Social Security. People have paid into Social Security, paid government for years. They are entitled, in the best sense of the term entitled, to get Social Security. Even if government has to go into debt to pay back those entitlements, those are necessary past obligations of government. The second kind of debt has to do with future productivity, like education, even keeping people healthy. I mean, you can't be a productive member of society if you're not healthy. Like infrastructure, roads and bridges and rapid transit and pipes and water systems. If we don't invest in these things, we cannot have an economy in the future. And so you shouldn't think of that kind of expenditure or debt created for those purposes as bad. It's actually good. You want those investments, and if you've got to go into debt to pay for them, that's no problem, as long as the future growth that you're going to get in terms of the positive economic growth. Now, I'm not talking about GDP, we can have an interesting discussion about economic growth that is either positive or negative, but let's put that to one side. But I'm talking about positive economic growth here. You're not going to get that unless you have a decent educational system and infrastructure and all of the other prerequisites to an economy. The third kind of debt is the current needs of people. If the government has got to go into debt, for example, right now in a national emergency, to make sure that people have the money they need to pay their bills while staying home, that is not bad. In fact, that is a necessity. We've got to do it. But when the Republicans talk about debt, they have no compunctions at all about creating a $2 trillion additional debt for corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the wealthy. That kind of debt they call, I don't know, they say, well, it'll pay for itself. That's trickle down economic nonsense. They have no qualms at all about spending for military and for defense. Spend as much as you want. They don't even know. I mean, it's impossible to tell where the waste is in the defense budget because there's so much waste. I mean, it's almost solid waste, if you pardon the expression. But in terms of the three categories of debt I've talked about, past obligations, future productivity, and what we need to do now for our people, not our corporations, but our people, Republicans simply, and right-wingers don't even understand it. They don't see it. They don't acknowledge it. So debt is very different depending upon the purpose to which the borrowing is put.
Mm-hmm. So you said you wanted to talk a bit about the election. I am a big Sanders supporter, and I'm with my friends who keep saying over the last few weeks, well, reality has endorsed Bernie Sanders. What are your thoughts? You just shared a little bit about the need for possibly a third party or a workers' party. I just invite you to reflect, because we do have an election going on, and extremely unprecedented situation with some primaries called off and delayed, and I think for good reason, but also it reveals again this idea of revealing the flaws of our system. Why is it so hard to vote in this country? This should be something that is not challenging, that we can do safely and securely remotely through the mail, that we are automatically registered. I mean, all of these broken aspects of the American political system are now in view.
Right. And the reason that the political system is so broken, the reason we don't have an election day that is a national holiday. I mean, let's get rid of President's Day. Who needs President's Day as a national holiday? Get rid of President's Day and let's make Election Day a national holiday. The reason we don't have that, and the reason we don't have universal mail-in ballots, and the reason we don't have kind of common sense registration when you turn 18 or when you get your license to drive. The reason we don't have any of this nationally is because a lot of the oligarchy doesn't want people to vote. Mm-hmm. They don't want a vibrant democracy. They're scared of a vibrant democracy. And voter suppression is rampant, but it's not just African Americans and the poor. I mean, it is African Americans, it is Latinos, it is the poor. They are facing quite extraordinary degrees of voter suppression. But there is a more massive voter suppression going on in terms of making it difficult for people to vote who are just ordinary Americans. I agree. Our democracy is one of our most, if not our most precious legacy from those who have fought wars and sacrificed for this nation over the entire life of the nation, and hopefully the most precious legacy we will hand on to our children. But it is, like other aspects of the system, deeply, deeply flawed and getting worse. Mm-hmm. Now, Astra, you asked, I think, the central question: how is this crisis going to reveal the flaws in that system? Not soon enough for the upcoming election, I don't believe. But are there opportunities here to organize around all of the issues we've been talking about, connect the dots, see how wealth and power have undermined both our democracy and our economy? Yes, I think definitely. Is it possible to see the system as a system, a political economic system that is no longer working for most people, but is working for the oligarchy? Yes, I think it's now possible to see that. Whether you are on the right or left, Republican or Democrat, is less important now than whether you are on the side of democracy or oligarchy. That's the real division that is emerging for many people, and I hope becomes much more vivid over the next 6 months. Then our politics becomes changed. Then there are political possibilities that we have not even imagined.
That could be the realignment that comes out of this. So we're speaking of democracy. We actually had a bit of democracy, and that we had some crowdsourced questions. So I thought we'd go to a bit of that, and I'm going to try to end with one that leads us in a good direction. One person asked, just basically, you kind of hit on this, I think, but if you were Secretary of Labor at this time and entrusted with overseeing things, is there one thing you would do out of the gate?
The most important thing, and let me emphasize this, is make our unemployment insurance system universal and accessible to everyone. Just get rid of the eligibility limitations that are there now. We are in a national emergency. We want people to stay home. We are shutting the economy for good reason. And everybody ought to be able to get unemployment insurance right now, regardless of whether they are have worked for 2 years or one year, or are a freelancer. Really, regardless of whether they are undocumented or homeless, everybody should have access to income now. This is a moral issue.
Yep. This is an interesting question. It kind of, to me, relates to some things that you wrote in your book, even though that was well before this crisis. Someone writes, why haven't we been able to supply enough test kits for the virus in the United States when, for example, South Korea was able to produce all the tests needed so quickly?
Hopefully there'll be a lot of investigation going on in the future about why we blew it so badly. But the fact is, we were not ready. And the federal government, and I have to blame Donald Trump. I don't want to make this partisan, because I think Democrats, as I said, I think Democrats lost the working class. I think Democrats bear and shoulder a lot of blame for a lot of things that have happened over the years. But on this one, Donald Trump and his administration clearly blew it. They knew what was coming. They could see what was coming. This was no secret. And the fact that we did not have adequate number of test kits was well known way before that inadequacy basically faced people very dramatically. We are still facing an inadequate number of test kits. And Astra, I'm not surprised, but I'm kind of shocked in a way that you get shocked when something becomes very blatant, something that you knew already, that everyone in Washington and every NBA player and every CEO who wants to get a test for this virus can get it. There's no question asked. But you try to get a test if you're just an average person and you are not showing symptoms, well, you're not going to get the test. We're already rationing in this country. Yes. And the rationing, I fear, is going to become more and more apparent, more and more oriented toward who has the influence, who has the wealth, who has the power. Once we start rationing ventilator equipment, who's going to get the ventilator equipment? You've got, let's say 5 ventilators, and you've got 15 people who desperately need them in the area. Who's going to make that decision on the basis of what criteria? Well, if it's business as usual in this country, it's on the basis of wealth and power.
Yeah. Well, because even before this crisis, we know that life expectancy for poor and working Americans was, that there's a huge gap of over a decade, I think, for men, for poor men and rich men. So poor people are already dying in the United States before this. There's a tweet that went viral I saw yesterday that was essentially, if you're poor and you want to know if you have COVID-19, the best thing you can do is cough in a rich person's face and then wait for their test results. People are trying to make light of
this. It's kind of grim humor.
It's grim humor.
It
is
funny, but it is grim.
Yeah.
And that's exactly sadly right. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of grim humor. Grim humor, can often be a very powerful political tool. Just keep that in mind.
Yep. Well, and that is one thing social media is good for. I mean, I was thinking in that question in your book about how you talk about how the United States doesn't really have a national policy, right? So China has a national policy. I mean, in the sense what we're seeing is this country's being fleeced. It's being stripped for parts. And that's part of why there wasn't a plan in place to sort of take care of the people of this country in the moment of a pandemic.
Yes, and even, again, the Democrats, I thought that the bill that emerged, the first coronavirus bill that came out of the House that had some protections built in, like paid sick leave, was in the right direction.
Yeah.
But did you notice that big corporations, even with regard to House Democrats, got the House Democrats to exempt them from the requirement of providing all their employees paid sick leave? Corporations over 500 employees don't have to do it. Walmart, therefore, doesn't have to do it. Amazon doesn't have to do it. So you've got these big corporations that are sitting fat and happy, and they don't have to provide paid sick leave in a bill designed to actually protect most of the public.
Exactly. So a lot, yep.
No,
this is.
I'm sorry.
No,
This is all about power. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is all about power. I mean, this is a little silver lining for me is I feel like people are talking about power more. And you've been a big part of pushing this conversation, and I see people taking it up. I feel that you're absolutely right to keep coming down to that. It's about power. A lot of people in these questions, so 2 questions. So this is maybe the darker one, and then I'll try to guide us towards light at the end of the tunnel. A lot of people here just kind of want to know your predictions for how bad this will be. Someone asked, will this be as bad as 2008? But you already said that it looks like unemployment rates are going to be Great Depression level very soon. So that, I think people want to know your honest assessment of what we're in for.
I'm not an epidemiologist,
Yes.
so I cannot make predictions about the course of the virus. But I can say from an economic standpoint, I would not at all be surprised if we were up to 25 or 30% unemployment, which is higher than the Great Depression. But I want to emphasize that comparing this to the Great Depression is not really appropriate. It's apples and oranges. The Great Depression was, as I said before, brought on by a liquidity crisis, a huge explosion of a debt bubble. This crisis is a public health crisis. It bears no resemblance. And the most responsible thing we can do is have a high unemployment rate right now.
And take care of people. Well, that
and
rate
take
is
care
there.
of people. That's
Exactly.
right. In other words, we want to shut down the economy. That's the most responsible thing to do. Shut the economy down.
Yeah. For
so
Americans, that's like very mind melting. I mean, we've been told nothing matters but growth. Nothing matters but the economy.
Well, maybe this is another learning opportunity.
Yeah.
Life is more important than the economy. Safety and health is more important than the economy. And we've got to go home, shut down the economy for some period of time, but we've got to make sure people have incomes during that period of time so that they can pay their bills and keep their homes and keep their family clothed and fed.
And then we need to reassess this whole cult of growth too, because we are seeing smog and air pollution diminish, and these benefits we haven't been able to account for. And we know, as your book, The System, was pointing out, that the system was not stable and health providing before this mess.
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the cult of the economy, the kind of myth of the market, has taken over so much of the public consciousness that it's been hard for the public to switch gears and say, no, the economy comes second. Public health comes first. Yep. And I keep on seeing commentary and reading people who I otherwise think of as very, very sensible, who are not getting this. This is not a complicated idea, but in order to get here, you've got to actually turn off the part of your brain that has been overwhelmed by the propaganda of the economy comes first.
Yeah. Okay, so on this is the last question. I'm going to read it, but I think it's a good one. Recently, support for fundamental system reforms has begun to coalesce, some of it even cross-partisan. Yet there are many who would say we should put all of that on hold for now. What is your view on that question? And how would you recommend reform movements sustain their momentum while showing respect for the very real and urgent needs of the current crisis?
Well, I would say, and this is sort of summarizing some of the things that we've talked about, but I'll try to put it more succinctly. People are learning a lot right now. Whether they are learning it explicitly or implicitly, they're learning a lot about the system. Once this crisis is over, and I'm talking about the immediate public health crisis, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, I think that learning can become more explicit and more powerful. And it's up to organizers and movement builders and everyone who cares about how power is exercised and allocated to get involved and build on what is learned.
I love it. We need to exorcise some power from certain institutions and corporations and then exercise some power in different places.
Absolutely.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Robert, and I'm so grateful for your work, especially right now. And I will be avidly following your Twitter stream as events unfold. Thank you so much.
Well, Astra, let me just return the compliment. I love your work. I'm a tremendous fan. And thank you so much for your time and your very, very insightful questions.
Thanks, and thank you to our hosts. And keep tabs on City Arts as well to all of our audiences, because they'll probably be doing more talks that now anyone in the country can watch. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.